Good morning, live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to our virtual discussion this morning, the launch of the Corruptions Perceptions Index. Hello, I'm your host, Andy Hodges. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this morning, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Paper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. Now, to our Zoom audience who are joining us today, please feel free to ask your questions via our chat room, and we will endeavor to put them to our guests. And if we're not able to, we will ask them to respond to you after the show. The Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, is an index published annually since 1995 by Transparency International, which ranks countries by their perceived levels of public sector corruption as determined by expert assessments and opinion surveys. Transparency International generally defines corruption as the misuse of public power for private benefit or gain. The 2020 CPI, published today, the 28th of January 2021, currently ranks 180 countries and territories on a scale from 100 being very clean to 0 highly corrupt. Joining us virtually this morning to discuss the launch of the Corruption Perception Index are Muchaneta Mundopa, she's Executive Director at Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, Tafaza Chikumbu, Head of Programs at Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, and Commissioner John Makumure, Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, ZAC spokesperson. Good morning and welcome to the program. Mucha, the annual launch, good morning. Mucha, the annual launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, has become an important event in the calendar of most countries. Why is this so, and why is measuring corruption important?
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for those who are watching from home. I'll start by saying that measuring corruption is by its nature a very difficult task due to various reasons, such as the fact that corruption is very secretive in nature. No one wants to be known that they partake in corrupt activities. And also there is no universally agreed definition as to what corruption is. I think the definition is contextual. But nevertheless, us as Transparency International, we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So measuring corruption remains a very key in the anti-corruption agenda, as it also helps us to just evaluate the extent of the problem in the country, the various forms in which it takes place, and consequently what action needs to be taken to mitigate the corruption that is taking place in the country. So in that regard, various measurements of corruption have emerged, but today we'll talk about the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, which is a tool that Transparency International developed in 1995 as a way of measuring corruption. So this is generally one of the most widely used indicators to measure corruption worldwide. So the CPI ranks and scores countries and territories based on how a country's public sector is perceived to be by experts and business people. The following forms of corruption are measured in the CPI: bribery, diversion of public funds, prevalence of public officials using public office for private gain without facing any consequences. I would like to highlight that fact. And also the ability of the government to contain corruption and enforce effective integrity mechanisms within the public sector, red tape and excessive bureaucratic burden, which may increase opportunities for corruption in the public sector. Then also state capture with narrowed vested interest, access of civil society to information and public affairs. So all those issues that when people are being asked about corruption, especially the business people and the experts, they then perceive how corrupt a country is. So the CPI uses a scale of 0 to 100, where a country which scores 0 is perceived to be very corrupt, and a country which scores 100 is perceived to be less corrupt. I would also like to add that there is no country that has scored 100 in this year, in this CPI, and it's seldom that a country will score 100 because there's no country that is totally free from corruption.
All right. Commissioner, you've heard there, Mucha, that the CPI, Corruption Perceptions Index, is used by a lot of countries as a barometer in terms of measuring corruption. So in your opinion, how is the CPI an important tool to track corruption, especially in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much, Andy. As far as the Commission is concerned, of course, the TICPI is a very important tool to measure corruption. This is a tool, obviously, she has explained, which is capturing public perception about corruption in the public sector. So all surveys are very important in the fight against corruption, so that the findings, conclusions, and recommendations can also inform the strategies that anti-corruption bodies and others can implement to fight corruption. So we very much welcome such a survey, the CPI, because we also use it extensively to come up with our own strategies to fight corruption, especially now that we now have a national anti-corruption strategy in place where all the key stakeholders are part of the implementation matrix. So the Corruption Perception Index is of great value as the various subcommittees come up with strategies and actions to tackle corruption.
Tafadzwa, in the latest 2020 CPI report, Zimbabwe has maintained a score of 24 out of 100, which I believe was exactly the same score in the previous year, 2019. So what does that actually mean, and what does it mean for the fight against corruption in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much, Andy, and good morning, viewers. I think, as Muchaneta has alluded to earlier on, this is an international score, which then requires us to look at it from a global and regional perspective to see that Zimbabwe's score of 24, before we compare it to the results for 2019, we also need to look at how we are faring compared to other countries in the region and also other countries globally. And as you can see from the report, we realize that our score is still way below the global average of 43 out of 100 and our sub-Saharan regional average of 32. And in Africa, we have countries like Seychelles, Botswana, which are still scoring high. Seychelles actually having 66 out of 100, and also Botswana having 61. But comparing Zimbabwe to other countries, you see there's Somalia and South Sudan right at the bottom of the rank with a score of 12 out of 100. And so as Transparency International Zimbabwe, we look at this from that particular angle to see how we are faring compared to other countries. But I think as a country, we also have to reflect and see our interventions for the previous year and the previous years vis-a-vis what is actually happening in terms of corruption. For me, I would believe that we still have public sector corruption, despite a number of interventions that are coming through from the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and other anti-corruption agencies. And as a result, I see a situation where the rising corruption and the endemic corruption in the country is actually obliterating all that effort, leaving us at the same post. But I would say that this is quite important for us as Transparency International and also the government of Zimbabwe to actually introspect and see what they're actually doing or what we are actually doing as a country to combat the vice.
Commissioner, you stated that the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission does use the CPI report as a barometer or index during some deliberations. But I suppose the question is, do you believe that the CPI is a true reflection of the state of corruption in Zimbabwe?
Andy, the CPI, of course, is an important tool to shed further light over the extent and dimensions of corruption across the public sector. So it's an important tool. to help us, have a bit more information, shed a bit more light over the extent and dimension of corruption in the public sector. But remember, the CPI is only measuring corruption in the public sector. But we also have got corruption in the private sector. We have corruption in other sectors. So that, for me, that is the only limitation. But in as far as coming up with actions and strategies targeting the public sector, the CPI really greatly assists. But what we also, as a commission, what we have decided to do is to also have a national corruption perceptions index that is covering the private sector as well, so that it is all encompassing. So the one that we would want starting this year to come up with will complement very well the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index that is only covering public sector. This one that we will come up with will cover both the public sector and the private sector.
Mucha, John there makes a good point in that the CPI report only looks at the public sector and sort of doesn't really touch on the private sector. And it takes me to my question, because critics have alleged that the CPI is not reflective of the true extent of corruption in a country, in Zimbabwe in particular. They point to the source of the data as one area of your concern. What would be your comment?
Thank you very much, Andy. And I agree with Commissioner Makamuri that the CPI has its own limitations. Perhaps just to also state that the CPI uses 13 data sources from 12 independent institutions specializing in governance and business climate analysis. We're looking at indices from the African Development Bank, Country Policy and Institutional Assessment, the World Bank Country Policy and Institutional Assessment, and as well as the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, among other indices that are used. So what the CPI then does is that it then correlates everything and reconciles all the different aspects of corruption into one indicator. But like what Commissioner Makamure says, it just then takes into consideration corruption that is happening within the public sector, disregarding the corruption within the private sector. But we all know that there is corruption within the private sector. The other limitation, of course, being that it takes into account the perceptions of business people and country experts, disregarding the views and perceptions of ordinary citizens. But what Transparency International then did to complement the limitations of the Corruption Perception Index is that it developed what we call the Global Corruption Barometer, which then measures the extent of corruption within the public sector using the experiences and views of ordinary citizens. I'll give you a look at the 2019 Global Corruption Barometer Africa edition, where 60% of the respondents in Zimbabwe stated that corruption had increased in the past 12 months, and also that 25% of the respondents who had used public services stated that they had to bribe to access those services. So those perspectives, also coupled with or complemented with various sectoral or national studies that were also undertaken as institution, then try to point or to paint a picture of the true extent of corruption within the country. And I would like to applaud Zach for coming up with the National Corruption Perception Index, which is going to also complement the CPI and the Global Corruption Barometer. So in as much as there are limitations, I think we also need to look at all the indices that measure corruption holistically and not divorced from each other, so that you can also have a correct picture of the extent of corruption in Zimbabwe.
All right, so it seems there's an extensive band of experts that you do tap into in terms of putting it into the report. Tafadzwa, it's all well and good having a corruption perceptions index, but I suppose the question is what lessons can any country draw from the 2020 corruption perceptions index, and how can it help them, I suppose, in their fight against corruption?
Okay, Andy, thank you. The 2020 Corruption Perceptions Index was produced against a background of COVID-19, and it actually speaks to how corruption is actually undermining the health system. And this is something that as Zimbabweans, we can relate to, how corruption in the health sector has actually undermined health delivery system in general, and also the fight against COVID-19. But one key lesson that I've learned emanates from the fact that the fight against corruption requires very strong institutions. And there's a finding that says that countries that perform where we have strong independent institutions and rule of law. And this is something that we need to reflect as a country so that we actually score higher in the next indexes. And I want you to look at a country like Singapore, which has scored like 85 out of 100 and is ranked actually 4 in terms of the best countries in the fight against corruption. When the first prime minister came into power in June 1959, he received gifts from well-wishers who wanted to ensure favorable considerations for their future proposals and requests, but he declined the same gifts. He actually wanted to show the rest of his other political colleagues and civil servants how he should take this particular issue seriously. And the anti-corruption laws in that country are actually applied to everyone, regardless of their positions, their political affiliations. And there's a specific institution equivalent to the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, which applies the law regardless of people's positions. But what is interesting is that they only have 2 specific pieces of legislation, which is the Prevention of Corruption Act and the Corruption, Drug Trafficking and Other Serious Crimes Act. But these 2 specific pieces of legislation, they're actually doing wonders in terms of combating corruption in that particular country. And looking at Zimbabwe as a country that has many different pieces of legislation, different institutions, you look at ZAC, NPA, the Zimbabwe Republic Police, the Special Anti-Corruption Unit in the President's Office, all these institutions, they're actually coming together to fight corruption. But we only have a single entity with the 2 pieces of legislation doing wonders in their own country. So this is something that we need to reflect on and see how best we can harmonize our efforts in the fight against corruption for a common good.
Commissioner, 24 out of 100, no change from the previous year, and the average, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa is 32 out of 100. I mean, looking at those numbers and based on those figures and on the report, can you say that Zimbabwe is winning the battle against corruption?
Andy, of course, the score is not pleasing. Zimbabwe has to improve. Definitely, the country has to improve. We are happy with the steps that have been taken, some of the achievements that we have realized, but we have a long way to go. We fully agree with the recommendations from the CPI 2020 of strengthening oversight institutions. We have to prevent corruption. We need our oversight institutions to be as strong as possible. They must be well capacitated and effectively carry out their mandate. So here I'm talking about, of course, anti-corruption bodies, the Parliament of Zimbabwe, and others. And we fully agree also with a recommendation on open and transparent contracting, public procurement. That's an area that we are prioritizing as a commission in 2021, the area of public procurement. We have done research in that area. We are also even teaming up with TIZ to carry out further research in the area of public procurement. So it's an area to prioritize if we are to win the war against corruption. Then citizen participation in decision-making in order to enhance transparency and accountability. That principle has to be given life. And as a commission, we are doing our bit in terms of harnessing the efforts of various stakeholders to participate in the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. So if we can give space to all the key stakeholders and our citizens, then we'll make headway in the fight against corruption. Just to give some statistics, in 2020, as a commission, we submitted 90 dockets to National Prosecuting Authority for prosecution. Our target was 80, but we managed to submit 90 dockets. And in 2021, we have targeted 180 dockets, double the number that we submitted in 2020. So we need to process these dockets. That's not our mandate as ZAC. So we just say we need also to, as government, to strengthen those other institutions that are responsible for the prosecution side. So that's an area we want to, prioritize, continue to engage the other relevant institutions so that, public perception changes. When the public is not seeing cases being finalized in the courts, then automatically there will be negative public perception. So if we can move in that area, then I'm confident that we'll make headway in the fight against corruption.
Thank you. Tafatswa, just your very brief comment. And I mean, the question is 24 out of 100, is Zimbabwe winning the battle? Very briefly, if you can.
As Transparency International Zimbabwe, we recognize the efforts that the government is actually putting in terms of managing corruption, but we still feel that they need to put more effort in terms of avoiding corruption itself, because in most cases, we shouldn't celebrate a situation where corrupt individuals are still many in the private sector, but then we celebrate how probably ZAC or the police is working in terms of arresting and prosecuting such people. But we want to see a situation where there's a change in culture in terms of corruption in our public institutions, not just public institutions, but also in civil society, in private sector, in all the other sectors of the economy, to ensure that we see the country going forward. So we still feel that 24 is really a very low ranking, which puts the country in a very precarious situation, because as you can see, the CPI is one indices that is used by even foreign direct investors when they come into a country. And if we continue ranking so low, it really affects investments into the country, even against the Zimbabwe's open for business mantra. We really want to attract investors, but corruption is one vice that can actually prevent investors from coming into the country.
You're watching the launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index 2020. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Mucha, consistent with the CPI theme for this year, which is COVID-19 and corruption with a special focus on health delivery, how does corruption impede the realization of Sustainable Development Goal number 3 regarding good health and well-being, especially as we are now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think we've all seen that corruption in general, especially when it comes to the health sector in terms of funding, or corruption within the sector itself, can literally mean the difference between life and death. I think COVID has shown us that. So corruption really affects the universal coverage by inhibiting people's ability to access quality health services and safe and effective medicines. What we've noticed as Transparency International Zimbabwe is that corruption really has affected the government's ability to respect, promote, and fulfill its obligation in terms of Section 79 of the Constitution towards the right to health care. And rightfully, as the CPI has pointed out in its report today, there is a correlation between a country's performance on the CPI and also the status of its public health sector to say. So countries that perform well on the CPI have better funding towards the healthcare sector. In contrast, countries such as Zimbabwe, with high levels of corruption, we are grappling to deal with the effects of COVID-19. But not only COVID-19, Andy. In 2018, the country was also grappling to deal with the cholera outbreak. And that's very sad because the country loses almost 3 billion annually due to corruption. And that is money that could be channeled towards our healthcare sector. So in this regard, corruption really means the difference between life and death when we talk about corruption affecting the healthcare sector. I mean, we have money that was embezzled, so to say, during the public procurement. You all know about the Drugsgate scandal. And more recently, we've noticed that there's also corruption happening within our public hospital mortuaries and private laboratories where they're issuing fake COVID-19 certificates. That also then poses a risk to the lives of citizens. But overall, I think our position as Transparency International Zimbabwe is the country could be investing more in the healthcare sector, but because of corruption, we're unable to do so. And that explains why our public healthcare sector is collapsing.
Commissioner, you heard Mucha there. She referred to a scandal or an alleged scandal that's happening in Zimbabwe. And in fact, scandals in COVID-19 procurement are all over the world, in developed as well as less developed countries. So does this form of alleged corruption set the nation back in fulfilling particularly SDG 3, which of course is good health and well-being?
Yes, Andy. There is widespread corruption in the area of public procurement. And in relation to the health sector, I think it's on public record that there's been massive corruption involving procurement of COVID-19 materials. And ZAC has not been found wanting in that area. Arrests have been made. Some culprits have appeared in court, but we have gone a step further to then unleash our systems review and compliance unit to carry out spot checks and systems review with regards to the management of COVID-19 resources. It's on public record that systems reviews have been carried out in that farm, Ministry of Health, and many others. And recommendations have been made, and some recommendations have been implemented. But it's an area that we are prioritizing. We continue to prioritize. As I speak, we have a crack team that is investigating theft of PPEs from government institutions. Thousands and thousands of PPEs have been stolen, and we're making headway. The culprits very soon will be arraigned before the courts. So that's an area that really we have to look at. But prevention is very important. We need to prevent corruption. And we need to continuously, as a commission, work with government institutions, review their practices, whether they are complying with their regulations,
this review
that govern them.
This review system you talk about,
various policies and procedures.
Oh, I see. So you set up teams of people to go into the various ministries or procurement agencies to review this review system. How robust and true to the investigations is it?
Yes, we actually have a systems review and compliance department, exactly, that basically is there to work with government and private institutions to review systems, procedures, regulations, whether they're complying with set regulations, with procedures, and then make recommendations and fix those issues. So in 2021, we have targeted 250 private and public institutions that we're going to be reviewing, carrying out what we call spot checks to determine if they are complying with set regulations, laws, and procedures.
Okay.
In terms of comprehensive systems review, we are targeting 10 institutions in 2021. So just to clarify, we are carrying out compliance spot checks in 250 institutions. Then comprehensive systems review in 10 institutions in 2021.
Okay.
So we're strengthening that area in order to prevent corruption.
Right. Tafadzwa, I mean, the theme of the CPI, of course, as I said, was COVID-19 and corruption with a special focus on health delivery. So what, in your opinion, are the implications of this type of corruption or corruption in general to sustainable development in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think, as you are aware, Zimbabwe committed to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, and 17 of them, which calls for an urgent action by all the member states of the UN. And Zimbabwe has to actually work tirelessly to ensure that we meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. In the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is a document that provides for the funding mechanisms for sustainable development goals, identified corruption as one of the greatest constraints on achievement of sustainable development or sustainable development goals in general. It is a cross-cutting issue which manifests itself in a myriad of forms, and tackling all forms of corruption remains fundamental to achieving progress in sustainable change. And this is also consistent with the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which calls for effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And
Okay, we seem to be having a little bit of sound problems there. We'll get back to Tafadzwa once we've sorted out the technical issue. Mucho, I hope you can hear me. The question is, of course, that some sections of society, including government, have admitted that the health sector in Zimbabwe has been inadequately funded over the years. And in fact, this creates an opportunity for corrupt practices to flourish as citizens compete for the scarce resources allocated to the health sector. So do you think that the allocation of sufficient or more resources to the sector, particularly towards COVID-19, will help in the fight against corruption? Okay, we seem to have lost a bit of communication there. You're watching the launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index 2020. This is live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe, brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe. I think it's time for us to take a short breather. And when we come back, of course, we'll continue our question of our guests, looking at funding for the health sector. And also, of course, there's reports that $2 billion has been recovered for assets forfeited by the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. So hopefully we'll get answers on those questions and more after the breather. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Sure that
Welcome back. You're watching launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index 2020. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Now, Tafazwa, apologies for the sound problems there via Zoom. But however, maybe you could briefly just finish your thoughts. My question, of course, was the implications of corruption on sustainable development in Zimbabwe.
Okay, thanks, Andy. I think I had highlighted that Zimbabwe committed to the achievement of sustainable development goals in 2015, and corruption by then was identified as one of the greatest constraints to the achievement of the SDGs. If you look at the number of sustainable development indicators, especially those highlighted by the SDGs, it includes eradication of poverty, quality education, quality health, fighting inequality, clean energy. And if we can relate to the specific issue around clean energy, you remember the Gwanda solar project and how we died a natural death, then we might miss an achievement of clean energy by 2030. If you look at clean water and sanitation, sustainable cities, the corruption scandals in the major cities and towns in Zimbabwe can actually point to the fact that it might be very difficult for us as a country to meet sustainable development. And corruption, like I've indicated earlier on, based on the CPI, is one of the indicators or determinants of foreign direct investments into the country. And even if we continue with this Zimbabwe's open for business mantra without combating corruption in the country and ensuring and assuring the world that we are indeed making strides in the fight against corruption, it might be very difficult to attract investors and also achieve sustainable development that comes from those investments.
Okay, Mucha, you know, some sections of society, especially and including the government, have publicly admitted that the health sector has not been adequately funded over many years. And of course, this may create opportunities for corrupt practices to flourish as citizens chase after the scarce resources. So, but is this a question of money? Because do you think that allocating more resources or enough resources to the health sector in particular will actually help in the fight against corruption?
Thank you, Andy. First of all, I want us to know that Zimbabwe is a signatory to the Abuja Declaration, in terms of which different countries came together, different African countries came together and pledged to at least give 15% of their national budgets towards the healthcare sector. But you'll note that in Zimbabwe, that has not happened. Our healthcare sector is still being given way below what was pledged under the Abuja Declaration of 15%. So the underfunding plus the endemic corruption that is generally there in the country is resulting in the collapse of our public healthcare system, like I've stated earlier on. But to answer your question, I'll do that in two ways. First of all, definitely there is need to adequately fund our healthcare system so that our medical personnel are well paid and our hospitals have the required equipment and medicines to carry out their functions. However, but my recommendation to different players within the healthcare system will be there is need for a sectorial anti-corruption risk assessment of corruption within the healthcare sector itself. Because like what Commissioner Makamuri highlighted earlier on, there is corruption pertaining to public procurement within the healthcare system. So pouring in money without addressing the corruption loopholes or vulnerabilities within that sector might also create a situation where we pour money, but we do not get what we've invested, so to say, as the money will also be channeled towards corruption activities.
We are unfortunately coming to the end of our program, but it's such an important day, the launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index 2020, and just a couple more questions I'd like to ask my guests. Commissioner, recent press reports, Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, as part of an anti-corruption crack team, recovered assets worth, I believe, $2 billion. You know, what is the position on this? Maybe shed a bit of light on that briefly. And also, if these assets were bought with illegal gains or corrupt money, so to speak, are you also further going to bring corruption charges against the citizens whose assets were seized as well?
Yes, and we have recovered assets worth millions and millions. and this is recovery. But there is the next stage of making sure that these assets are forfeited to the state. So the legal process is underway for the assets to be forfeited. So there is a difference between recovery and forfeiture. Yes, of course, the culprits, they will face criminal prosecution. So in addition to the assets being recovered, criminal proceedings will also, take place. I wanted also to just quickly point out that protection of our witnesses is extremely important. And as far as the whistleblower protection law is concerned, what we have been informed is that the principles of that piece of legislation have been drafted. They are with cabinet, so we are waiting cabinet approval for the principles now to be to now inform drafting of the legislation. So that's all I wanted just to.
I think the whistleblower act, which has been on the cards for a long time, as you said, Commissioner, is probably way due time to be put into law. I want to finalize, round up the discussion this morning. Tafadzwa, we look here about issues such as transparency and accountability. So what really are the sticking issues that need to be addressed? And on top of that, what are your recommendations? What would you recommend to the anti-corruption agencies to bolster or to improve their fight against corruption in Zimbabwe?
Thanks, Andy, for that question. As Transparency International Zimbabwe, we realize that transparency and accountability are compromised across public sector in Zimbabwe. But however, I'm of the view that there's need to put concerted effort in specific sectors of the economy, especially the extractive industry and public procurement. And in our debate and discussion today, I think the issues of public procurement or corruption in the public procurement kept coming, and we strongly feel that this is an area where underhand dealings are actually rampant, and we need to actually ensure that we fight corruption in that particular sector. But at the same time, resource leakages in the extractive sector. I think recently we learned of one of, I think, Henrietta Rushwaya, who was actually trying to smuggle gold out of the country. And this is a sector that is also very much known for secrecy and opacity. And it's a sector that we really think that as a country, we need to focus on in terms of ensuring transparency and accountability. And the amendment of the Mines and Minerals Act is one of the key instruments that we feel as Transparency International Zimbabwe would actually change how transparency and accountability issues actually looked at.
Unfortunately, sorry to cut you off. We are coming to the end of the program, and I do want to ask Mucha just one final question. Recommendations. You've got the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission here on this program. What would you recommend to anti-corruption agencies? Briefly, please, your response brief. What would you recommend? What would be your key recommendations for them to start at least chipping away and getting that score from 24 up to at least the sub-Saharan average of 32, if not higher?
Thank you, Andy. My recommendation and final thoughts will be that there is need for genuine political will to see the fight against corruption in Zimbabwe succeed. And that entails putting in place mechanisms and a conducive environment allowing citizens to hold the government to account, as well as public officials. I'd like just also to highlight on the culture of impunity that currently prevails within our anti-corruption agenda in Zimbabwe, where senior public officials and other politically exposed people are not being taken to task of the corruption that they partake in. So there is need to hold those who take part in corruption accountable, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their office that they hold. So my issue on genuine political will to see the fight against corruption succeed, and not just rhetorics. Thank you.
Transparency, accountability, political will, and making sure that the law does not fear or favor anybody in the country. We have come to the end of our program this morning. You've been watching the launch of the Corruption Perceptions Index 2020. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN and our partner, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. I'd like to thank our guests today, Muchaneta Mundopa, Executive Director at Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, Tafazwa Chikumbu, Head of Programs at Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, and Commissioner John Makamure, Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, ZAC spokesperson. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for appearing on the program this morning. This broadcast was brought to you by Zim Papers. It's a pleasure. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN, and as I said, our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Well, that's it for me this morning. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and please, you all be safe.